Well, welcome to the Good Fight Forevermore. Tonight, we're lucky to have a guest on, Veronica Volk, who grew up in the Soviet Union, down back behind when it was time when we had the Iron Curtain. And she's going to share some experiences with us tonight. So, welcome, Veronica.
Thank you, Ed. It's a pleasure to be here with you guys and share some of my experiences growing up in a communist country. I think a lot of people now wondering what it was like and how it's becoming similar to what's happening here now. I'm starting to see a lot of similarities, which I couldn't see before. So.
Yeah, that is concerning. And this is what I think people do need to hear, because people take freedom for granted. And unless they have an idea of what they're losing, I mean, so tell us a little bit as how you grew up when you were younger. You were in what, the St. Petersburg area?
Yeah, I was born in St. Petersburg, and then my family moved to Moscow when I was like 13. So growing up in Russia, I think like the thing was, as a kid, I didn't know any better. I think my parents were, both of my parents were professors. So we were coming from like pretty like academic family. They were pretty educated. And so we were probably more well off than a lot of people were. But on the other hand, I could see, like I went to school that were all public schools, but on the other hand, they were kind of like private schools because they were more elite schools. So I could see, kids out there, all the political leaders there and I could see the difference, right? So while everything was for equality or equity, whatever it is, but on the other hand, you could see that the kids were like from a lot more privileged countries. So they had better benefits, or they had better, like their dachas or their country houses, or, like they were going abroad or doing other things that other people couldn't do. So you could see it, like that there was, while everybody was trying to promote that it was a socialist country, everything was communist, but you could see those kind of things. And you could, like in TV newspapers, you only have several TV channels at the time, but it was all obviously communist propaganda. There was only so much information allowed. Everything about Western countries was evil. Like they were basically evil empires, that it was all trying to exploiting people. It was like all capitalist countries that were exploiting, the employers were exploiting employees, that it was like poor employees they were not telling us that a lot of employees had a pretty good life. And we went through a lot of shortages growing up. There was always shortages of stuff, food, clothes, pretty much everything. We used to go sometimes with my family to East Germany. And for us, East Germany was like paradise. We were like, oh my God, there was so much food here. There was like so much more, like better clothing. And I know for people in the Western world, the East Germany was also another repressed country that people would be kind of looking down for East German. And it was going even like to East Germany. We could go in, like in Berlin, it was weird because we could go to the Brandenburg gates, but we couldn't go on the other side. We were not allowed to go because it was only people from West Germany could come to East Germany through the Brandenburg gates. So you could kind of like almost felt like a secondhand citizen. And the first time we were actually able to cross the border into West Berlin was in 1990, and still we could go there, but we couldn't exchange the money there, even like Deutsche Marks from East Germany into the Deutsche Marks in West Germany. So we could just go across the border, look around, and just basically come back. And as for like growing up, it was like a lot of indoctrination going on from the time we were little. It's learning about Vladimir Lenin, who had like started the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, and like reading books about his childhood from the time we were in preschool. And it was always, obviously, all the teachers, everything, there was a lot of brainwashing, mind control going on. And most people actually believed in what was going on because they believed in the socialist society or the communist society, that things were supposed to get better. So they were always saying how, everything will be better in the future. So it was always kind of like everything was always out of reach. And it was interesting when I first came to the US, I was spending time with a friend, with my family in San Francisco. And I was really puzzled. I would be going to the stores and I was like, can you explain to me, like, why when I go to different stores and I see the same item, the prices are different? I just couldn't comprehend it. She was like, because they just can set the prices. And I was like, what do you mean? Like, I couldn't even understand it, because in Russia, everything was government owned. All the stores, everything was government owned. So if you go to one store, the price for the item will be the same as you go like 20 other stores. So that was kind of like interesting also to see. And as for like Russia, also the other things I would say, we were all like indoctrinated, like as I said, like when we were little, we were supposed to be members of the, like elementary school, like Octobriada, which is kind of like children of October Revolution, basically. And then it was pioneers, where like we had to wear like a red scarf around our neck. And it's like, oh, you had to be like, in order to become, like pioneer, then it's like a young member of a young communist league. And that was something you had to be if you wanted to go to college. So when recently there was the interview with the lady who was, I don't remember her name, who also went to Moscow State University, who was supposed to be, trying to be, was it bank controller or whatever the role was, and how she was saying like, or that she had to become a member of the Young Communist League and that she had no choice. I think part of it wasn't probably really true, because we had a choice, it was a choice of, if you wanted to go to the university, that's what you had to do, right? So there was like no other choice. And as for grown-ups, the next path would be you had to be a member of the Communist Party if, when you graduated from college, if you wanted to have a good job. So both of my parents were members of the Communist Party, even though they didn't really believe in what was going on, but it was kind of like you had to play the game if you wanted to have a good life. So you had to say the right things, you had to do the right things, whether you believed in it or not. And I think people would be like, among themselves, would be laughing at a lot of things. But when you were working, you had to kind of pretend, keep the face that you believe in all that was going on. So, and if you didn't become, it was always a choice again. So if you wanted to have a good job, then you would have to be a member of the Communist Party.
That's interesting, because you said a few things there that really, the indoctrination part. I'm kind of seeing that today in the U.S. in the schools. They're indoctrinating people. Yeah, totally. And the equity part.
Yes, with like critical race theory, and it's indoctrination and mind control. And it kind of like happens, I think, once you start indoctrinating the kids, right, then you have the kids who come home from school and they start like looking at their parents, will be like, what are you believing? And right, it's like, then, for parents, it's also harder to, if like all your friends believe in one thing, right, then it's a lot of times for if the kids don't know any better, it's hard to see something different, even though it's just funny, because obviously we didn't have the internet. We had 3 channels on, I don't remember how many, 4 channels maybe on TV, which was all propaganda, or maybe like mostly Russian movies, occasionally foreign movies that were allowed. So same thing with the books. There were like a lot of books that were banned in Russia. So people sometimes would just make photocopies and just people would pass them around. And even like at some point, I remember the photocopying was banned because they were afraid that people will be making copies of things that were not supposed to read. So like right now, I think on one hand, it's funny because we have so much uh, access to like social media. We can see what's happening in other countries. But on the other hand, it depends where you go, because sometimes I talk to my friends, and while I'm getting even through Instagram once kind of sort of news, my friends are seeing totally different kinds of news, even though they might be on Instagram and Facebook, but they're following different people. They're following only the mainstream media. So they can't see anything else outside of what the mainstream media allows them to see. So it's, which is like, I feel highly censored information now. And people are, the funniest part is that people are happy about it. There are a lot of people are not curious and not interested in seeing something else. And if a lot of times, if you even ask people if they're open to other opinions, they're not.
Yeah.
And you probably see the same thing, right, Ed?
Yeah, yeah. What was the penalty? Like you said, you tried to photocopy books that were banned.
I think we
But
just didn't even have the, the photocopiers. It was like really even hard to find them. I think like you probably maybe like in the university we could find one, but generally there was like people were just not making photocopies. There was just not no photocopiers.
yeah, because total control of information is definitely.
Right, exactly. The more you control it, right? It, like now it's becoming, even now you would think it will be hard to control it, but it's like as long as you do it kind of slowly and the way you do it, I think it's someone has to decide how to do mind control. It's just not that happens that someone just says, oh, like we should just give this kind of information. I'm sure there's a lot of thinking going on how to present information, what information is allowed, what's not allowed. So there probably a lot of people are working on it because it's pretty sophisticated project to pull through, to do it not just in the US, not just do it in one country, but we're seeing it now all over the world. So
Yeah, or like even like when we do a lot of we grab the protests off the internet. Now we
right.
grab it off the internet, we post them on our shows, but we don't see any of that information on the regular news stations. I don't see anybody protest, the protests in Australia, the protests all over Europe.
Right.
I mean, you can tell the information's already being cleansed to a point where unless you really go digging for it. The other interesting thing you said about was the coming into the stores when you came to the States. You seen the same product in different stores, an actual competition,
Right.
which is a form of capitalism, where before you just at a store, you were looking for something, you were glad to find it. And I think it was, let me see, was it, no, what's his name? The Russian prime minister, the
We
Russian
had
president.
at the time, we had Gorbachev at the time. We had like a whole bunch of different people. Were you talking about the current one or the?
The one when Reagan was in office,
It was
Brezhnev.
probably Brezhnev. Yeah. So that was like, yes. I don't remember what year he died, but you know what? It was funny. It was the first time I think he was in power for a while. He was in his, I think, 70s. He was like at the time, right before he died, he was like in pretty bad condition. So I mean, people would be like half of the time not sure if he was dead or alive because occasionally he'll show up at meetings, like occasionally, then he wouldn't be seen for a while. And when he would be talking, it was like even hard to understand what the guy was saying. But I remember that when he died, it was like time of mourning and the whole country was in mourning. And everybody was like so worried and like what will happen with the country because like the great leader is gone, right? And it was funny because I don't remember how old I was at the time, so I was a kid, but I was like, oh my god, so what's going to happen now? Like, because people will be always talking how like other countries might attack us and things like that. Still, like while US was, I think, the kids were hiding under the desk and preparing for any kind of, disaster or like Russians attacking them. Russia was doing the same thing. Like even starting elementary school, we would be, like in the basement and the kind of bunkers and like in our school, practicing to put the gas masks on, which I could never do. It was like an impossible thing to do. And it's like, if you try to breathe through that thing, it was like impossible, that it was like going all over your head. We had to do at school, we had to put together AK-47, same thing we had to do in college. In college, we had to train as like nurses, kind of like it was part of the training was supposed to do, even like though I had nothing to do with like nursing, I was studying sociology, but we all had to do, like all like it was like mandatory military service at 18. But for like like for women or people who were not going like at school, we were supposed to be like studying nursing and putting together AK-47s, which I was not very good at either. And I didn't have much at the time. I didn't have much interest in that at all. Now I think I have more interest in that, actually.
Because they always tell a story here about how when he came to I think he came to America, and Reagan and they arranged for him to go out and see a little bit of the country. And I guess he went into a few stores, and what he said was exactly what you said. He says, but he said, I think we're in trouble because just looking at what the people have availability to here compared to what we have is going to be a problem. So I think he recognized that. And that was something when you said that, it caught my mind. And like we're seeing now, you said the great leader. I mean, we don't even know if Joe Biden is all there. He doesn't sound like he's all there.
Right.
It's just the comparisons now are kind of, it really is, it's hitting me to the point where we're seeing the cleansing. We're going to see if you comply, like you said, if you complied, you got availability to college and everything else.
Right.
So did you have a lot of access to a lot of children whose parents weren't, say, in the more professional realm of the Communist Party?
I think more like when I lived in St. Petersburg, because it was, like my father was professor at the university there, but kind of like where we lived, it was pretty much, like everybody different levels there. And, like you had like a division there. You had poor people, very poor, kind of like very poor people, but we didn't really have homeless people at the time. I think most people, like people who were kind of crazy, that would be, like end up in mental institutions. And you wouldn't see, like now you see a lot more homeless people there, or like crazy people. But before, I think they would just put them away somewhere like mental institutions. So you wouldn't really see those people around much. So when I came to the US, I think I was surprised to see, like especially when I was living in New York, like the number of homeless people. And I think a lot of times that realizing that people, even like someone would try to put them housing and everything else, they just wouldn't last there, right? Because they had like a whole bunch of different issues, and they just stability. It's just, I think with people with mental issues, it's a lot harder to live. Even someone gives them housing, it still doesn't work for a lot of people. So that's kind of like an issue. And the other thing I find, I think with kind of like similar something like we had in Russia, but I see in a lot of people here too, and which is probably will end up getting worse with like the people depending more on the government, is like the money consciousness issue that I think so many people, like growing up in Russia, like grew up in like in the US as well, grew up with like money doesn't grow on trees. We're not rich. We can't afford this. We can't afford that. Like rich people are bad. And I think it just kind of programs kids from a younger age not to dream big for a lot of times unless they get out of it. And especially for like people I know, I see like a lot of people who are like entrepreneurs and starting on their own versus people who work for companies that they're getting a paycheck every 2 weeks, that people kind of just get used to it, that making money is hard, that a lot of times they can't make it. And the more people I feel rely on government benefits, I feel like a lot of times it's harder for those people. That's why, like, you see a lot of times people 3, 4, 5 generations living on welfare, because that's how they grow up and that's what they know. They know that they're not like, they're poor people, that they'll never be able to afford anything, and then they just go and it continues going on. But now the more people start depending on the government, that's when people will learn that you get things from the government. So
basically, you were set into a basic class system in the Soviet Union, right?
right.
Where, you were at this level because your parents were such and such. So other people who were just general workers, could they excel into another class? I mean, was there a way to
Um,
say,
they could, but a lot of times it probably was like, it was hard for them to do. The other thing we had was also there, it's just kind of like interesting now that you asked. It was hard to move a lot of times from a city to city. So like, for example, we moved from like St. Petersburg to Moscow because my father got a job in Moscow. But generally it was hard for people to move. Like, you couldn't just decide to move to another city unless you already had a job lined up. And a lot of times to get a job, you had to have a stamp in your passport with the address in the city where you live, which was not easy to do. So to me, like growing up, I always felt like people want to live in big cities, like people would want to live like, like in the US, that people would want to live in New York. And when I first came here, I was a Rotary Club exchange student, so I was living in Alaska. And I remember asking people there, I'd be like, why do you live here? I'm like, can you move to New York? And they'll be like, yes. And I'm like, so why don't you move to New York? And they're like, we don't like New York. We like it here. And I'm like, what do you mean you like it here in Alaska? Like, why would you like it in Alaska when you can live in New York, which is great big city and it's like a happening place? They'd be like, we don't like it. And to me, it was kind of like a foreign concept. And the other thing was, growing up in Russia, we were all brought up to be atheists, right? So we were told that religion was opium for the people, that we cannot, like being religious was not an option. Basically, I don't remember when they decided that it was not an option. I think after the October Revolution in 1917. And I know even like at Easter time around I went to like Moscow State University, they will send the professors to nearby churches to make sure that none of the students were there. So it was kind of a thing that probably like some old grandmas could go to church that had like nothing to lose, but nobody else would. So they were like pretty particular about that. So when I came to the US, we studied atheism at the university, and I would be like literally asking people, I'd be like, are you religious? And they'll be like, yes. And I'll be like, do you actually believe in God? And I'll be like, I'm like, you're like a smart person. I'm like, seriously. And I'm like, didn't you learn like the same things I learned before, that God doesn't exist? I'll be like, it's like amazing, like smart people, and they believe in God. I just found it like really fascinating. But that's what was happening because we didn't have the option. People were not allowed to believe in something, we were allowed just to believe in propaganda. So a lot of time when I was in college, we were studying like history of the Communist Party. That was like one of the main topics. And we had to literally sit and take notes from the book, like literally copy paragraphs from like Marx, Engels, Lenin. They wrote like, I don't know, dozens of volumes of like the works of like a whole bunch of stuff. We literally had to sit in the library and copy paragraphs of what they wrote in our notebooks. And then we had to show it to our professors so that they could see that we actually were doing the work. And and I had one professor for like a professor of history of the Communist Party, and it was interesting. It was before like 90. It was like early mid 80s, I guess. And the guy spent 20 years in labor camps during the Stalin years, because during the time, a lot of people, neighbors or someone, if you said something wrong, you would just disappear and end up mysteriously at like camps that nobody would hear. Like generally you would probably die there or nobody would hear from you. But the guy, literally, my professor, spent 20 years there, but he had nothing. He was blind also. He had nothing bad actually to say about Stalin. He would always say like that he was a great leader, that there was such great order during the time that he was in power, even though this guy was in the camps for 20 years. And I've met other people who also spent 20 years in camps, and they were so brainwashed. They believed that it was that Stalin was a great leader, that he was taking care of everybody, that he just didn't know about their particular case, which is kind of like fascinating that people just couldn't see through it.
When did you find out about how many people actually died under the rulership of Stalin?
I think people were talking about it. They were like I think, was it, I don't remember now, 20 million people. It was a lot.
Yeah.
We lost because we lost, I don't remember now how many people, but we lost a lot of people also during Second World War. And the problem with the Second World War was right before it started it was great patriotic war called in Russia, which started in Russia in 1941. A lot of generals, commanders in their army, they were put in labor camps, or they were fired, or got, I don't know what happened to them. They probably died because Stalin didn't think that they were patriotic. They were doing great jobs. So the borders were left pretty much unprotected, or not protected well at the time.
So it's pretty much is what we learned here. We were hearing here about any dissent or discussion against government, because back here in the 60s, people were protesting, doing all these things.
Right.
And, saying, well, this is terrible, blah, blah, but everybody had the right to their opinion. So basically, what you're saying, there was a very strict, firm control of society.
Right. Yes. Everything was very strict. And it was a lot of mind control, just telling you that you have it's hard to convince you, like somewhere, imagine now if you live in Venezuela or North Korea, the leaders have to convince people that they're having the most amazing life, right? Because if the whole country knows that that's not true, that people all over the world have better much better lives, that, that everything, all the shortages, everything else, doesn't happen in all countries, that probably more people wouldn't be willing to put up with things.
Now, when, like you said, you mentioned you had gone to to East Germany,
Yeah,
for visits with the family. How now to do that, was that just because you got rights because of your father and mother's position in the college? Or?
well, you know what, my father, when he was professor of history at St. Petersburg University, some of his students, or the graduate students, were from East Germany. So we would go there, and to go there, actually my parents had to get permission from the Communist Party at their places where they worked, that they were good members of the Communist Party. You couldn't go otherwise. And same thing for, me and my sister, we had to get permission from, our schools, that they actually had to have meeting for young communist league meeting to see if you were a good member, if you deserved to travel to another country, even though it wasn't like even like a Western world, it was like another socialist country, but that's how they were, preventing people from traveling. So they didn't really want people to travel around and see the world, because you would hear a lot of times people would be saying like, or someone who traveled for work, like, occasionally for work or something else in the US, and people would be like, oh my God, like in the US, you go to the store and like, you'll be amazed with the supermarket. And people would be actually struggling, like a lot of times, to believe those people, because everything they'll be reading about the, capitalist society would be how brutal it is, that it's only capitalists and like wealthy people have access to things, and the poor working people are really like exploited, compared to someone in Russia where everybody was considered equal. But I think, like, to me, it was also fascinating coming here. They're like, how can they possibly have so much stuff, like so many things, and all the stores and everywhere in the supermarkets, like 20 items of everything, while in Russia they will be struggling to have like, milk, for example, at the store, or like sometimes it will be butter, so you have to go to like 10 different stores, like looking for meat or something else. And now that I'm talking to that, I remember when I was like in high school, my mother would actually send me to the grocery store to their, like, because they had meat department there. So she would actually send me there so I could flirt with the guy who was working at the meat counter, because like if you go, like there would be like they would hardly have any meat there, or like they might not even have any meat at all. So you actually had to go to the back room, and they're like where the fridge, so that they actually will have to pay him like extra money to get good cuts of meat, or get meat when other people wouldn't even get it. So she would actually send me there to flirt with the guy. And I hated doing that. And she would be like, always be like, no, if you want to eat, you just have to go and do it. Well, obviously she didn't want to do it herself. So, right.
Yeah. So even with a position as college professors, you still had to
right, everything, right. It's still, you still had to get access for food, or like most of the time they would be like saying no, even like toilet paper at the store, like everything was shortage. You go there, like I don't know, like what country you like go now, probably like North Korea, where like a lot of times they'll be like, not, there were like periods of time, some worse than others, where there was just not much of anything. So they just didn't have like a variety. And again, everything was planned by the government, like, because nothing was made by, there was no free enterprise. Everything was planned by the government, all the prices, all the production. So they obviously not enough resources, no, like nothing else. So there were a lot of bribes going on and a lot of corruption, because to get anything done, government do anything else, the government officials were not making much money. So you had to bribe people for everything.
So that's the truth, because like I said, we've seen that in so many different ways. It's actually started portrayed in some movies about how people had to actually go out of their way, like you said, foot or something, just to get what they wanted. And the other thing is, there's on the freedom of movement part. So you had to be approved by the party to be able to go anywhere.
Right.
That's interesting, because we were watching a clip on Tucker had a college student on, and he's going to a university, George Mason University. And we're watching the clip, and he's talking about how to do anything now there, they need to have their papers to have boosters and all these other effects. And it's just like a different form, I think, of tyranny.
Right, it is, right? It's like at one point it was before controlling your movement, like where you could be, where you could live, or like you have to have stamp in your passport to go anywhere, like anywhere to move to another city, or it was hard to move to another country. But now I think it's happening all over the world. But green passports that you need to have, some countries might say like it's okay if you have one vaccination, like one shot, the other countries will say, no, you have to have two, like other places like Israel now, I think they're having like the second booster already. So I think like all the countries are tightening the rules pretty fast, and they're like all using each other probably as example, thinking like, well, what's happening in Australia? Even like here, I think in the US, a lot of people I feel say what's happening in New Zealand and Australia, it's great example of how well the countries handle COVID. And you'll be like, what news are you watching? And it's like fascinating because I feel like we have a society divided by the information they get. While information is accessible, you can find the information, but you have to look for it. You have to be curious. You have to be open to things, because if you're not open to things, if you think that there is only one way of doing things and seeing things, and like my friends, some of my friends just say to me like, oh, you're a conspiracy theorist. You don't like, you follow some quacks online, like Dr. Mercola or like other people. So they wouldn't even take them seriously because the government tells them not to take them seriously. And everything, like, you like, no matter, like I would be like bringing up like what happened in New York with COVID patients, you know, the Cuomo like authorizing putting all the COVID patients back to the nursing homes. And I'll be like, well, that should be criminal. I'll be like, well, he didn't know at the time. So, you know, they just justify so many things that were going or are going on, or like the hospitals are not open to alternative treatments that many functional doctors said that they work on the monoclonal antibodies. They just, you know, like they just agree like, well, if Fauci didn't authorize it, that means it's not good enough. So a lot of times I feel people don't understand the emergency use authorization, how it works with the drugs and the process, and how it benefits the pharmaceutical companies most of all. Like, you'll follow the money trails, see who is making the money, and it can be pretty scary, as you know.
Now, way to limit movement. Even like Ben Carson spoke out on that topic the other night about how saying Omicron will not work. The what do you call it? What's the term for the biologicals they're using? The cures. The therapeutic monoclonal antibodies.
On the antibodies, yes.
Yeah, antibodies. And they said it doesn't work against Omicron. And Ben Carson said that's a lie. So that's a flat out lie. So we're getting the pushback on both sides here.
Totally. And I've heard it, someone like also like, yeah, like they're telling people that they don't work, and the government, it's like they're like very slow at like releasing or whatever. They're not allowing states to get it. I don't know what the process is, but it seems the government is slowing down something that could help so many people, you know, in the US and in other countries. And I know in other countries, they've been also, I think it was in India that they authorized the theory so that they wouldn't, I don't know if it was Omicron or Delta, so it wouldn't spread as much. They were giving them some therapeuticals, but they were like not telling other people, they were not releasing information what was in them. I think people were, thinking that part of it probably was ivermectin. But here, like, people honestly like laugh at me. Like, so many people say that it, you know, it works. And so many people like in this country, the functional doctors have used it. And other people just like laugh because mainstream media laughs at it and says, oh, that's just for the horses or the cows or for like the animals. So it doesn't work. So people are just not very curious to be open to like treatments that they work. But it's funny, the other day I saw like in the UK, they were actually giving a patient who was almost in coma, they were giving her Viagra, and she only found out after she woke up from coma that they were just testing different medicines, but she didn't even know beforehand, obviously. So, but that it helped her actually to get out of coma. So, like, you never know what can help.
Yeah, because I think that was invented for one thing, and they found out that hey, this works for something else. But I mean, that's the idea of free treatments, and I
Right.
guess so. Basically, what you could say is you're very familiar what life is like when the government controls everything, as opposed to when you got a free market
Right.
that's open ending, more things are available. So, in other words, in the old Soviet Union, you could not actually just say, I want to start up a business. Well, most of these businesses like passed down through the families. And is that like you said, if you went to the butcher, was the butcher
Well, the
or
butcher,
family of
everything was
butchers?
government owned because it was all the stores. We didn't have like the private, like, we just didn't have the private. I think it's hard for even to understand for people in the country that everything, all the stores, everything was government owned. They just didn't have like all of the time. Like now they have a lot of supermarkets and big supermarkets, but at the time it was, like they had some kind of supermarkets, but a lot of times it was just separate store. You go a milk store, like where you would get milk with cheese and eggs. Then you'll go to the, like kind of butchers, but it was all like the like store of like vegetable and like fruit to get. And it's just everything was government owned. So the customer service was awful. So everything, we didn't have many like hardly like any, there were very few like restaurants or cafes, very, very few of them. And the customer service was always awful because they had like no interest. They were, like all getting paid, whatever, not much. And it was like they were just not, like the poor customer, always like very poor customer service.
So basically, too, but what was it seem like the government officials, the higher up ones seem to have had plenty, while the people just didn't have much at all.
Yeah,
Because
people probably didn't have much, like didn't have much. So it was kind of like there were a lot of engineers, and it was kind of like you'll have an average salary, like whether you were a teacher, a doctor, you're kind of making the same amount of money. So like here, like you'll have doctors, make a lot more money than say a teacher, but over there it was kind of similar. Most doctors were women, and it was kind of being pretty much like no different than being a doctor was no different than being a teacher.
yeah, but so basically, though, it didn't involve anything around talent. It involved around a set skill. So in other words, here, like you've seen yourself, if you're really good at something and you can excel, and
Right.
that's when you make a lot of money, and the more
Yeah.
effort you put into it.
Right, you could like do that. And I think over there it was more as I said, a lot of things are like a lot of corruption going on. So like a lot of times in order to get a colleges, you had to like know people and things like that. So you still had to get good grades, but you kind of had to have connections to get good schools, could get good jobs, which I think is like now it's pretty becoming here like as well, that you have to know people and make connections. But I think a lot of it was like like having connections or bribing someone here and there. And I know we had a lot of students from like former Soviet Union republics like Azerbaijan, Georgia. Those people always had a lot of money. I don't know if they probably from, I don't know, from where they had the money, but they were like literally paying the professors at the end of the semester. They would just go when they would be taking the exam. They would just basically we had like those books with the grades that we just have to give to the professors. So they would put the grade after the exam. And those students would just put cash in there. And because they didn't know, like some of them barely spoke any Russian. They didn't really study much, but they always had money to go to restaurants, have like more fun life. So they will be just paying off professors. And they did the same thing actually those students in like medical school. So it was kind of like scary because I don't know what they were even learning in medical school over there.
Yeah, because even here now, this kid who's going to become a lawyer on the show we saw, he said a lot of people don't want to speak up, which reminded me of what you said about the Communist Party. Speak out against, even though they feel like the boosters and all these things are forcing on them, they don't want to take them, but they're afraid to speak up because they're afraid when they go out to get a job in the future that they're going to have that on their record. It sounds
Right.
to
It
me
can,
like some kind of social score.
right. It does sound very much like a social score, right? Once you make it dependent on, like your booster shot, or like then it will be like, telling you like you need to get it every 3 months, every 2 months. It's like, I think it's agreeing what the government tells you to do. And basically, once you get to the state that, if the government tells you to do it every 3 months, how many people the government tells now people to get the booster shot every month, and they'll tell them that it's for the benefit of other people. How many people do you think will be going and getting it? Like millions of people, right? So if they do, all the government needs just to say that it's safe, and that's it. The government doesn't need to provide any numbers. The government does not tell people how many people have died from the COVID shots or how many adverse reactions there. Most people have no idea about how many people have died or how many people have had adverse reaction. They just think that people making it up that it's safe.
Yeah, well, right now they're barring people. They knocked off Marjorie Taylor Greene from Georgia. She was exposing facts. They knocked off Dr. Malone, who was the inventor of the equipment, who was involved in developing the mRNA vaccine. So we're seeing a lot of that happening now. And with students afraid to speak up because they're afraid that there's going to be a social score, scars against them in the future on their
Right.
record, they're actually seeing the same thing that you saw. If you weren't, like you said, to travel, to go anywhere, to do anything, you had to be in good standing as a member of the Communist Party.
Right. So it will be kind of the same thing. How long it will be before you need to have, credit score to get on the plane before, you can go anywhere. It's like, did you get your 25th booster? How did you pay all your bills? Are you eating healthy? Well, like it can be anything, right? So, and I think there are like, I saw some forums, I think, like Canada is also planning to implement, the social credit system. So I think all the countries like Canada, I think like Australia, New Zealand, those countries are going like rapidly down that hole. But everybody else is slowly moving. And it was funny because my sister's in Ireland, as I told you, and she was the one she was like never into politics or anything else, but somehow she got really interested in COVID. And it has become her like passion, all the protests. She's at protests like literally every week there. And when she was first telling me about mandatory masks, mandatory vaccinations, or what was going to come, that will be a requirement to go to a restaurant. So like go to get a job. I was like telling her, I was like, oh, like you're a conspiracy theorist. Like it's not going to happen. It was probably like last like March or April or whatever of 2020. And she was like, no, it's coming. Like, it's like, this is what's going to happen. She's like, I know it's going to happen. And look, it will be hard to, people wouldn't be able to travel. It'd be like ongoing lockdowns, mandatory people like vaccinations. And I was like, no way, like the US will never, it's a free country. People will never allow this to happen. Like nobody will ever agree to any of this craziness. And now, almost 2 years later, that's what we're seeing. And what's fascinating is how many people are agreeing to all of this, even like when they don't have to.
I agree. I mean, I was surprised when it even happened over in the UK and even countries like Ireland, they even agreed to any of this. I'm like, I couldn't believe it. And then when they started doing it here, I mean, the 15 days to slow the spread, I
Right.
thought would have been temporary, but they just kept rolling it and rolling it. Yeah, I agree. So basically, what I'm saying is we're seeing a complete familiarity with what everything we were told about. So I'll put it in this scope. I think I told you a little bit about this when we talked, but we were told all this money was going to fight off the communist,
Mhm.
the Cold War. We didn't want to live like they do in Russia because the people can't speak their mind, they can't roam, they can't do this. And all of a sudden, it just seems like they found a way to circumvent the whole Freedom Act. Like I said, I always said the Constitution. It's basically the rights are there. They just found a whole way with this COVID thing to circumvent all our rights, and people just gave them up out of fear.
Right. Fear.
Not,
Well, it's like, you know what, but it's not even fear. I think a lot of people gave them up. A lot of, yeah, like a lot of people I feel are in fear of COVID because it's like psychosis or whatever, right? Mass psychosis, that people are like so paranoid of other people. They'll look at, it's funny because everybody now looks at healthy people and they're like, look at them as they're just like all the people who have some kind of a disease, like lepers, right? Like, if you're not vaccinated or if they don't know like your status, or like if they just say a person, a lot of people look at each other kind of like lepers, like, oh, I don't know if they're contagious or something else, which is kind of crazy because it's like even like places like New York, which is supposed to be, city which is like so open-minded because of it's so much diversity. You have to be vaccinated to go to a restaurant. You have to go to like McDonald's, you have to be vaccinated, right? So like if you're obese, unhealthy, you can still go to all those places. You can still spread the virus. You can get the virus, spread the virus to everybody else, and you're fine. But if you're healthy and don't even have a virus, you can't go anywhere at all.
so let's compare that to what you're saying about the professor who spent all that time in camp. And it's almost like he didn't want to say anything bad about the Communist Party who
No,
had
he
locked him
didn't.
up.
No, he didn't.
That's a part that's concerning because, like I said, I'm so used to growing up at a time when we could speak out. Now you
Right.
speak out against somebody about COVID, and they're calling you not just a conspiracy theorist, the AG of the U.S.A. Garland, but I think that anybody who disagrees with the narrative that the government's putting out is a domestic terrorist.
Right.
That was
That's kind of a
issued back in what? That's definitely like, okay, all bets are off now. We got to go back to the Constitution. Did you know anybody in the Soviet Union who kind of just, fell out of view of everybody's sight, shall we say, and didn't hear from again? Do you have any friends?
Not with like I was born in 69. So that was like all those things happened before me, which was during Stalin years, which was very common. So people would just disappear like one day. And so many people, I think like my grandpa, at least one of them was, I think, arrested at one point, but I don't think he spent too long in jail. But like seriously, people would go somewhere, like, just disappear. It's like they would show up at night, they'll arrest you and they will say, that you were against Communist Party, and you'll end up in camps, jail could be for years or whatever. And could be like your neighbors could report you. They could have heard you say something. Maybe they didn't like what you said. Maybe they didn't like you. And, it reminded me like last year when I was talking to my sister and she would be going visiting some friends. She would say that actually neighbors would be calling the police of like her friends, like neighbors, and reporting that there were people who were not supposed to be there because technically they were on lockdown. So they were very particular. So it's not like even the government was policing, but also people themselves. And I think that's scary because it's not just the government pushes people to do that, but people starting to police as well, like what people should do, like what everybody, like, they feel like people should be vaccinated, only like vaccinated people entitled to go to restaurants. So then they want to see only they want to make sure that the restaurant doesn't break the rules. So they get the support of those people who are complying, right? And a lot of them complying for, while they're saying that they're doing it for other people, for their health, to protect older people, they're actually only doing it for themselves because they want the convenience. To them, life is back to almost back to normal. And to them, that's what matters. That, well, I can go to a restaurant. That's what I'm doing. And I want to go to a comedy club. And it's kind of like ironic. You had to get vaccinated or boosted to go to a comedy club, right? So, I think there are so many of those people who are just doing it for convenience reasons, so they can go to a restaurant. So it's convenient for them, so they wouldn't stick up. And the other category, I feel like people who are working for big corporations, because big tech or whatever it is, it's like big machine, right? They have their requirement, they tell everybody to do it, and people don't question it. They just do it. They think like because their boss tells them to do it, then it's safe. Government tells you to do it. Your manager or president of your company tells you to do it. They all tell you it's safe, right? Even though they don't really know, because they don't check the information. They just assume it's safe because someone else told them it's safe.
Right. That's basically taking the word of the government. But there are a couple of points that you stated there. So basically, when you were growing up in the Soviet Union, most of the people were already in compliance.
Right. You
So
had to be in
yeah.
compliance.
So
We had
everybody
the
was
dissidents. Yeah, we had dissidents, but the dissidents usually, would end up somewhere in like labor camps or somewhere else. So they didn't have a good life unless they happened to be Jewish or could leave the country, because the only people who could emigrate to another country, say to the U.S., because there, like probably, there are like a lot of Russians or people from Russia in the U.S., but they were all of Jewish descent. Well, actually, in Russia, Jewish was not really considered a religion. It was like it is here. Jewish was considered a nationality. So we all had, like in our passports, we all had nationality. So for example, my nationality would be, say, Russian, but someone who is Jewish, their like nationality in the passport would say Jewish. And a lot of times they would have issues actually getting good jobs or going to college or getting good jobs, because they were likely to get their education or get a good job and then immigrate, leave the country. And if they did that, their manager, or like if they were in college, their professors, they would be in trouble because their students or like the employees left the country.
because we remember that a lot of Russian Jews were migrating here. And we always heard the horror stories of, like you just said, if you're a dissident, you'd be taken off and put in a work camp. Where
Right.
here we had the right to disagree and everything else. So all those stories we're hearing were true. It's like, I remember we used to have the commercials on TV, I think through the 70s and 80s, about donate money to Radio Free Europe so they could broadcast to people behind the Iron Curtain and all the countries, including Russia, to let them know what was going on in the free world. Like you said, they
Right.
didn't have
Oh,
much
yeah.
access to that.
Now that you said that, I remember my father had one of those like little radios that had the shortwave radio that we would get the Voice of America and like Radio Freedom, so that we could listen to them. So you kind of had to be careful, just listening, because a lot of times with the antenna and everything else, you wouldn't have a good reception, or some days you'll have better reception. But to us, it was ability to know what was happening in other countries, what was going on, because my parents were always like very open-minded about that. And so like my father spoke several languages, and I think like in the 60s he was like went to England with some, you know, group tour or something. So like he kind of like knew what was going in other countries. So because I think if you were more educated, you had more exposure, you can get to certain, you know, like even the library, like you will have access to certain things based on like what work you had. So, you know, maybe to certain magazines, like my father probably would like access to more things than like other people. So, but yeah, we would be listening to like the like Voice of America or Radio Freedom to see what's happening in other countries.
Yeah, because that's what we were told. I showed people Huckman and Don who were told, you know, if you get caught, which goes back to what we were just talking about, like we've seen in Massachusetts and other states with the COVID parties, people would turn you in. They said if anybody found out you were listening to foreign information, they would turn you in, you know, to
Right.
your neighbors in Russia because you were getting this information. And that's where this whole information, freedom of information is a big deal here. So I got another quick question for you before we go. We'll cut and go to part two because I really like to hear, you know, how you felt when you did get to America, how you got here. But the on that aspect of the information, did you ever have like any could you tell there was like KGB around? Did you feel like there was people spying or keeping an
Uh,
eye on
yeah, I
you
think
or
a
your
lot of
family?
times when people would be talking on the phone, you would hear like the clicking sounds, and you didn't, you know, like you didn't know because, like, say, my father worked kind of for well, everybody worked for the government, but we were more like working for like Institute of like Marxism, Leninism, which was a think tank, so that was associated with the Communist Party. So you didn't know it was like someone might have said something, or if they were listening to a lot of conversations, but a lot of times you would hear, you know, like different sounds on the phone. So people would be kind of, I think, a lot of times careful of what they say, because especially, you know, like my parents were members of a Communist Party, so they had a good job. So we had to be careful about what we say in public. Obviously, with their friends, when the friends come over, we could be just talking. People would be making fun of the government, of like what was going on, of all the shortages, politics, and everything else. But you had to be careful, like who you speak up. Like I wouldn't be able, you know, like if you go to, like, say, in school, you had to pretend that you believe in all the like, you know, like communism, socialism, whatever was there. So you kind of like always had to pretend into that.
Yeah, you always had to have like measured speech.
Right. So you're always right. But that's what we were studying, right? We spent so much time studying history of the Communist Party and all the things that we just like were absolutely useless, right? So like about communism, which we really didn't need to know. Even studying English, it was a lot of times reading texts about Russian Soviet, like Soviet peaceful initiatives. So when I came to this country, like I didn't have really like speaking like English, in terms of it was hard for me to communicate with people because that's not the language we were like really learning. We were learning how to tell people about like Russian peaceful, like Soviet peaceful initiatives, and you know, basically the Soviet Union was a peaceful country. And then,
Well, see, that's the whole thing, though, is the idea of measured speech. What people don't understand, and so I'm going to ask some questions when we do part two, is that, you know, what they consider hate speech or offensive speech today, that's just measured speech.
right.
And that's what you experienced. Like you said, people would get together, they'd like to, you know, make a few comments, but some of them had to be measured. You had to watch what you said on the phone. And now we know all communications are being recorded anyway. So, I mean, you know, when people say, "Oh, go watch what you say," it's like, well, anything you do say is going to be recorded now. So, you know, the measured speech part is the concerning part, because even hate speech, that's protected under the First Amendment of the Constitution.
Right. And
You
the
can't
funny,
harm anybody, but if you don't like what somebody's doing, you have the right to call them out in the U.S., where you, like you said, if you call them out, you could have somebody probably stop by, knock on your door, and ask you some questions. Is that safe to say?
yeah, people or people would lose jobs or something will happen.
Huh.
So you kind of just have to do like the same thing, like if you work for a big company here, you kind of have to play the game, because if you like, a lot of times now, if they see something you post on social media and everything else, right, you can be fired. So if they don't like something, so people are like very particular about their social media presence, what they say, and like you have to play the game. If you're, I think, like now working by yourself, you don't care as much, although like now you still kind of like have to worry about what you say, so you're not labeled as a domestic terrorist or something else. But it's kind of funny because part of it is trying to be, the government, everybody is talking about being inclusive, being politically correct. But on the other hand, it's, like we live in a free country where people should be able to say, like if you get offended, like if I get offended that you call me the Russian people are like whatever, you can say they're lazy or they provide bad customer service or whatever, like I can be offended by anything, but that's kind of like my personal problem if I get so offended by everything, right? It's not your problem. You have the right to say what do you want. Like I don't have to agree with that. I don't have to then listen to you or talk to you or whatever, but it's like becoming so, trying to be politically correct. It's just getting to the point that it's just kind of like irrational and crazy. Like, and it's just getting crazy and crazy. Like all the words that are getting banned, like you can use this, like now, like a lot of times they say you can't like say mother, or it has to be a birthing parent, or like things that just don't make any sense. It's like, why create a problem when there's no problem?
Could you call it, say, communist creep coming into our country? Creeping
What
its way in? Would you consider it to the form of communism you're used to? Do you
it's
consider this word cleansing a form
yeah,
of communist creep coming into our country?
it's creeping in, just like, when someone constantly is trying to control what you say, or like becoming a lot of times blaming certain people, like critical race theory, or guilting people that they were like guilty because they were born white, or which I find it's like really, to me, it's very crazy. Like I come from a country, like I don't know why I would be responsible or guilty because I was born white, like I was born in Russia where we were all white. So there wasn't much diversity. Like, and like I think in my school there was one girl who was half Korean, but like we just did, it was like everybody was white. So like we didn't have much diversity there at all. And, like Russia for many years, it was kind of for I don't know, how do you pronounce system, with like a lot of like peasants and, like kind of like owners. So you have there, you didn't have like white and black, the black people were slaves. Basically, they're like white people were slaves. So I can't blame white people doing something to my great grandparents, or like my father was in Second World War. I'm not going to blame Germans for anything, because of that. So it's kind of like being, I think, looking too much in the past and just getting people in there. I think one of the problems is also getting people in the victim mode, because once you tell them that they're disempowered, that they're victims, right?
Yeah.
So if you know that you're a victim, you're not capable of much. If you know that you're getting good grades because you're Black or any other different color, and that you're getting good grades because of that, and someone else of different race has to work a lot harder, that's not really kind of helping anybody else. I read this story and it was kind of like, as teacher was trying to explain to the students what, like they were talking all about socialism. So I think it was like a story. So the teacher said to the students, so just, like everybody will get the same, just do your homework and everybody will do, get the same grade. So the first week they did it. And then the students who were like great students, they did good. They, like because they did all the homework, everything else. The students who didn't do much, they were happy because they didn't have to do very much, right? So for the students who were good students, the average score, everybody else went down by a little bit. The next week, it was the next test. Then the good students figure out like why study really hard if we're not going to get good grades, like grades anyway. So they stopped studying hard. The students who were not very good, well, they figure out why bother anyway, right? So
But everybody gets a trophy.
right. So like everybody gets a trophy or like whatever the average score was. So the score went down even more. The third week, the score went down even more because the good students were like why bother really? Because if like I'm not going to get a good score and the other students are not putting much effort, I'm not going to put much effort either. And then the teacher said, well, this is what happens during socialism. So because nobody has to work really hard, or like you don't have to, if everybody gets like the average, why would anybody put more effort into something?
And that's why you have empty store shelves.
Exactly. That's why, right? And now you see the same thing happening in Venezuela. You have North Korea, right? So you have those countries, and there were the leaders are trying to convince them how great everything is. And it's funny that people who are promoting socialism, I think a lot of it is probably coming now in the US colleges, right? A lot of colleges seems to be liberal. I think it's I was reading somewhere, it's kind of like a joke that like Republican parents have to spend several $100,000 to send their kids to college to get indoctrinated with all the left theories, right? So, and that's what's happening in a lot of colleges, right? You don't have too many colleges that are still open-minded. They're considered open-minded, but a lot of times they're not. So
and the ones who are preaching for open minds are the ones with the most closed
exactly.
minds.
That's the funniest part. And when I first came to the US, I think the family that I lived with in Alaska when I was an exchange student, they were Democrats. And then when I moved to New York, most of my friends were Democrats. So I just I was never into politics. I was never interested in politics. So I just figured out, since my good friends who I liked were Democrats, that I was a Democrat too, because I didn't know anything about politics. I didn't even know like who the vice president or anything was, right? So then when I moved to Massachusetts, kind of like a lot of my friends changed and became like were Republicans. And then I kind of started doing research more and I started agreeing more with the concept, but I was still not interested probably until last year when I just realized that whatever the information I was getting from the government about COVID, that a lot of things were just not adding up. And I felt like I started just doing research. And the more I started doing, I was like, this is like actually fascinating how many things are going on. And then I started looking back and I was like, I can't believe I consider myself a Democrat. I'm like, I don't even know what I was thinking, because now I'm looking at what's happening in California and a lot of Democratic cities with crime, and it's just getting crazy and crazier. And a lot of judges, the kind of the Soros appointed judges, and that promote basically crime, that they're not putting people in jail. And like now, I think they're having this new concept of I don't remember what it's called, but like instead of putting someone in jail, they have the person who commits the crime, the criminal, sit down and talk with the victims so they can find
Yeah.
some kind of peace in them. Like I just like reading about it. I just find it fascinating.
It sounds like a Rolling Stones song called "Sympathy for the Devil" to me.
Right. Yes,
Oh, he
exactly.
just contradicts everything. So let's cut, and then I'd like to find out more about what it was like when you first came to the country, because pretty much you've caught on to where we're going. I think we all see where we're heading, and it is scary, and especially
It
from
is.
someone like I said, like from your perspective, who has seen what all this government control can do. And then now, for what year did you say you got here?
I got here in 1990.
Okay, great. So we'll take that up in part two. 1990, what Veronica experienced. How's that? So we'll cut the recording for a minute. We'll take a break.
Sounds good.